Hi, and welcome to The Breakdown, a new footy podcast / vodcast from the minds behind HPN football. My name's Cody Atkinson. You might know me from occasional articles on the ABC and, of course, HPN football. With me is Sean Lawson. Sean, show yourself.
G'day.
Maybe he can't show himself. This is all live, but this is Sean right here, Mr. Ken Behrens. Ken Behrens, what does it feel like to be a sort of at least a local celebrity, local high point here with your work in putting Andrew Barr's true words to screen?
I don't know if I'm a celebrity. It seems to have sort of escaped from any individual identification, and it's just out there in the wild now.
So how much gear have you got? Anything?
The Raiders have not given me one of those jerseys or any season tickets.
It's why the Raiders won't win the flag this year, right?
One of many reasons.
It's the only reason.
Ricky Stewart's an idiot.
So we're not here to talk about the NRL. We're here to talk about the AFL finals. You might have seen our piece on the ABC this week about how the Sydney Swans have defied expectations to make the AFL finals. We'll get to that a bit later, but we're going to run through the 4 AFL finals. We're going to make it short and we're going to make it sweet. Let's start with Port versus Geelong. So there's a couple of key issues here, and we're just going to talk about some of the key turning points that might affect the game. We're going to pop up a couple of heat maps to see where the strengths are. There we are, for each team. And let's have a look at Port versus Adelaide. Let's go from offensive score first. That is, how do we define offense score, Sean?
That's a relative ranking of points scored per inside 50. So if you're over 100, you're scoring more points per entry than average. If you're under it, you're scoring less than average.
So we can see here that Port's attack isn't strong, but their defense is quite stellar. Geelong's attack isn't great, but there's a good reason for that, isn't there, Sean? It's been a bit of a hodgepodge attack this year from Geelong.
Yeah, it has. They've had a mix of personnel. They obviously only got Cameron in there at points. I think they're still figuring out how to work with not just Hawkins and Cameron not getting in each other's way, but also how the other pieces move around them, how Rowan moves, how Ratugolea moves.
We ran a piece on Toby Green a couple of weeks ago on how he might polarize some people, but one of the best parts of it, my favorite chart, let's go to that now. Sean's running all the visuals because we can't see his face today. Sean, let's think of him as the internet here. And we've got Toby Green scoring a lot of goals from contested marks, but you'll see that there's not many Geelong names on this list. You'll see a lot of key position forwards from other clubs popping up early and often, right? And that's because they love to get Tom Hawkins into space, don't they? That's how they operate. So it's a really, I think I used this word earlier today, heliocentric design. Now, when we think about...
Yeah, Tom Hawkins is the son in this analogy. Well, I suppose he was a father-son pick, wasn't he?
He was a father-son pick. Now, how do you think Port's defence, how would you describe Port's defensive structure?
They're not necessarily sitting there wrestling with the big guys directly under a higher ball. They have a very kinetic defense. A lot of guys who move around quite quickly, get across to cover each other and try and rebound and launch. And when they got Aliir, there was some thought that he might help them with wrestling with the big boys, but that's not the kind of defender Aliir is either. He sort of really added to Port's ability to do that, what they were doing last year with the rebounding and the covering and the zoning sort of stuff, rather than try to address their weakness.
I think last year they played super high. Aliir, I guess, is like he's nearly taken Trent McKenzie's role, and McKenzie's taken that next shift down to the more key position players. And there's some thought, I guess, going forward that this week that Hawkins might see a bit of McKenzie, might see a bit of Aliir. They're really switchable, I think. I think you'd see Aliir come 50 metres off his notional defender to take intercepts. And I think it's a really fluid defence, whereas last year they played super high. This year they're forcing the issue a bit. Let's go back to the heat maps, Sean.
Yep, they're not. Yeah, so Port is looking pretty good in defence this year, actually. I think
second best defence in it.
They're not getting it out the back. They're not conceding out the back as much, and they're not conceding, I think, to the big contested marking forwards quite so much as they did last year.
And that's really going to play into their favour here when they play Geelong, because Geelong's not that type of team either. It's really nearly a perfect matchup for Port, you'd think, depending on how Cameron and Hawkins fit with Rowan and co, which we haven't really seen this year, the fully fledged defence.
No, we haven't. And of course, remember last year it was pretty much Tom Hawkins ended Port Adelaide's season by himself. So they'll obviously have that at the front of mind.
Yeah.
In their planning.
I think it's going to be a tight one. And you'll see that Port's offense has been hot and cold. They've had a lot of personnel issues this year, but they've had a lot of tall goal kickers, a lot of variety between like Giudices, Marshall and Dixon, and their resting rucks. But Geelong's defence has been so solid for so long. You don't think that's going to play a huge part here? It's just going to be less variable, maybe?
I think so. I mean, Port have the tools to stretch most defences, but Geelong is pretty much designed to not be stretchable.
So this seems like the swing might be the midfields, might be Port's midfield, who has a lot of strong names, versus Geelong's host of all Australians. Let's filter that by mid-score, Sean.
Yep. So that's the balance of inside 50 entries. The theory there is basically your midfield and other players operating in that part of the ground gain you the territory to give the opportunities you need to score and deny the opportunities to the opponent. So Geelong is the second best team in terms of the inside 50 differential, and Port Adelaide is fifth, and still pretty good.
Oh, look, and it's a really tight sort of setup there. It's going to be really hard to differentiate between the two teams. Certainly for the year, and I'm just reading a tweet here by JT Galliano on Twitter. He's been doing a lot of great work with the Richard Little data set. And when we're talking about all these sort of advanced figures and numbers for many years, it was held pretty close by Champion Data. There's been a number of great data scientists who have started to open that up. And Port has scored a lot off turnovers. They've got a huge turnover differential and about an extra goal a game than their opponents off clearances. But Geelong, by contrast, have got about a goal and a half a game off clearances. So notionally, they're better in tight, but Port will try to get the difference off turnovers. Do you reckon that's probably fair?
Yeah, I think so. That turnover game is so vital to so many teams now. I think
it's really modern footy, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we've got a Richard Little chart showing how they've been going over the course of the year.
That's the JT Galliano chart, and it's perfect there. So you can see Port just down there, just above the Swans in third from the bottom, and Geelong third from the top there. In the last few weeks too, Geelong have really amped that up, that clearance game, whereas Port, they've bumped that up, but it's still turnovers that are their big score source. Now, just generally on score
worrying
source,
for Geelong.
It is.
The last few weeks, their turnover differential has sort of dropped off a bit. They've got a bit more vulnerable on that.
Yeah.
Apparently.
So let's just quickly say that it's going to probably be the midfield here that sorts the game. You reckon?
That's often the way, but I think so, yeah. Unless, Hawkins or Dixon just really get a hold of an opponent, get a few big marks. That's the high variance part is Dixon clunks 4 contested marks, and that might win him the game.
So the other thing we're not going to do, unlike a lot of podcasts, even though it's the first ever football podcast hosted by 2 men in their 30s, we're not going to give you predictions here. We're just going to give you things to watch for, things for the neutral fan or even the devoted fan of a team to sort of latch onto and watch the game within the game.
Yeah, I think everybody understands that both teams can win the game, and there's a spectrum of possibilities. We don't need to pick one of those possibilities to claim is the correct one.
That's exactly right, Sean. So let's move to Sydney versus GWS here. Yes, so we wrote about Sydney this week. It's a really good piece on ABC News. Read it or not, but there's some really great stuff in there. And really the big thing is that the Swans had the best defence for about a decade, didn't they, Sean?
Yes, they did. Oh, we've got a chart for that too. There we go.
It's a beauty, isn't it?
It is. That's the defensive score, the same measure we were doing in the heat map, basically showing Sydney basically had the best defence for their entire previous era in terms of points conceded per inside 50. They just he was really hard to score against them pretty continuously from about 2012 to about 2016.
And if you hover over it, GWS are no slouches in that respect. They've done quite well. They've gone from about the low point to basically Swans light. And that's even without Phil Davis for big chunks this year. And he's been left out of the elimination final team. I guess that's a story that sort of has slipped from the mainstream footy radar, but they've found a really nice mix of young defenders, and Sam Taylor's come on. I haven't seen that.
Did they leave Davis out?
Davis is an emergency, yeah. So he's been out of the selection mix for the last little while. But what are the Swans doing now that's even a bit more dangerous? So we get into it a bit later in the piece, but it's really their score sources, what we were just talking about before. Let's go down there.
Yeah, very much so. So their defense hasn't really dropped off that much. It's not as
it's not top three,
impregnable
but it's top 5.
as it was, but they're still pretty good at defending. And what they're doing now is they've spun that defense around into a really potent form of attack in terms of most of their defenders are really good at rebounding the other way now. And you can see Swans lead the league in points from turnover per game this year.
Yeah, and they don't even concede a ton from turnovers. Their differential is great, and that's what we're talking about. There's a few different styles of play when we're talking about different ways to play football, and you'll see it right there. The Swans for the
biggest differential as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a fantastic chart. There's some great sports analysts out there, and we're lucky that we've had the opportunity we've had. We encourage everyone to follow pretty much everyone in the footy stats community out there and the footy analysis community, because analysis just goes beyond stats too. But the Swans like to play through the corridor and like to kick 45-degree kicks. We'd love to show you some vision, but for this episode, we're just going to go with just talking about the numbers and the styles of play. But they like to hit on the corridor. That encourages more turnovers. When you go to the wings, generally you'll get more out of bounds, throw-ins, even potentially ball ups. The Swans don't like that. They like a bit of the chaos ball through the middle because I guess they like to trust their defence. It's less rock solid than before, Sean, but I guess they've still got that trust and understanding they'll be able to bail them out of trouble.
Yeah, it's still pretty potent. And this other one we brought up here just shows how much of their attack is coming out of defence specifically. So it's not necessarily a forward half turnover game. They're not necessarily chopping teams off as soon as they get out of their 50. What they're doing is turning it around once they get a bit deeper. Guys like Jake Lloyd and Jordan Dawson in particular have been just two of the best in terms of score launches and rebounds. So what that means is they're not just rebounding it out of defense, they're actually creating scores. Like they're the originating point of a lot of chains that end in scoring. Whereas some of the other really good rebounding and some of the big super coach pigs like Aaron Hall and Jack Zeeble, because of where North are as a team, are not quite as effective at getting those scoring chains off their rebound. I think in North's case that'll come. But yeah, Lloyd has really been slept on, I think, for how potent he's been in his rebound play, not just in the fact that he's getting that rebound.
Yeah, Lloyd and Dawson particularly, those two outside of the All-Australian mix, was a bit of a surprise to me because both on the numbers and the vision, maybe this is a bit, people are sleeping on Sydney a bit, but those two guys have been critical. And even Tom McCartan there, we wrote about Tom McCartan. He was a forward who's transitioned down defence late last year alongside Dawson, and he's been a revelation. He's one of the few taller guys who can intercept, mark, spoil, and attack off his own ball.
He's the guy who really probably tipped Sydney's decision towards not giving Aaliyah the contract he wanted. They were very happy with McCartan. And I think that's basically been borne out. McCartan, he's not quite the interceptor Aaliyah is, not yet, but he's very much taken up that intercept marking position in the Swans.
And you've got Rampy up there too. Rampy, slightly undersized as a tall defender, but he does give you an extra rebounder. He's third for rebounding at the club, and he often gets rotated through the harder defensive matchups. Yeah. So
and his spoiling and intercept marking has actually dropped off this year as these other guys take over. That's allowed Rampy to be more of a ground ball defender and more of a defender of smalls, which he's also very good at.
Yeah, he sits at that 190, 193 from memory size, which is perfect that you can cover the talls in situational situations, and you can also take that centre bounce midfielder who rotates forward to create that mismatch. It doesn't actually create that much chaos when you have someone like Rampy there. Even Lloyd really can do those types of things.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Giants very, very quickly. We talked about their defense being quite strong. Let's go to Toby. I was going to say, let's go to their defensive thing there. Let's go to the Toby Green one because I love that one. No, let's go down. Let's go down. That was the right one, sure.
This was the right one, yes.
That's the one.
That's how Green scores his goals. Ground ball gets some contested marks.
And that's just such an impossible mix for even the Swans to match up on. They've got a couple of guys that they'll try to run through, but if Green gets on and we talked about his potential to get suspended and cited by the tribunal, but if he gets on, he's almost impossible to stop. He combines some of the best attributes of a small forward, kicking goals from ground balls, and also contested marks. Melbourne have thrown May and Lever onto him in situations, and even Petty, I believe. Like, he's almost impossible to find an exact match for. And
yeah,
he's going to shift the Swans' defence more than any other guy because that screws up the matchups for Hogan. It screws up the matchups for Himmelberg, for the rest of the forward line.
Yeah, I think he's the one you'd probably be looking for Rampy because of Rampy's versatility to try and get on him. But GWS will have ways to pull Rampy away from him, and that'll leave guys like Cunningham and if Melican's playing Melican to try and cover him, which obviously have deficiencies versus Toby's tool set.
So let's go back to the heat map very, very quickly here. So you'll see that the biggest weakness for GWS is their midfield, and they're just not getting balls inside 50, but when they get it inside 50, they score at a pretty good efficiency. For the Swans, if they dominate the field position, and they've done all right at that, you'd think that they've got a good shot.
Yeah, they probably don't necessarily need to do much more than break even around the clearances and so forth, which is good because they won't have Mills or Kennedy, who have been the two best in terms of clearance and contested ball around the stoppage, particularly in the two games against GWS. So that'll mean, Warner's going to have a big ask in his first final. Parker will have to do plenty. Guys like Rowbottom, who are not quite the hardened bodies, they just need to put up a credible presence, I suppose, not let GWS just walk it out of there and gain the territory.
That's very well put.
Force the turnovers as the ball comes out.
Very well put, Sean. Now let's have a quick look at that JT Galliano chart, the fourth tab there. And let's just have a very, very quick look. Again, the Swans turnover by differential, especially in the last 2 weeks as I move my own head from the recording. Last 2 weeks, they're up 3 goals on their opposition in score source from turnovers. For the Giants...
Yeah, some of that's opponent, but that's been pretty consistent this year.
The Giants were underwater from turnovers for most of the year, but they've rejigged their defensive setup. They've moved Lachlan Ash further up the ground. They've given all their defenders a bit more of a license to attack. But more importantly, it's the clearances for GWS. They're ahead by a goal a game now, when they're ahead by half a goal a game. If they're to beat the Swans are up by 1 point a game in the last month of footy. I reckon if they're going to get an edge, it's going to be Taranto, it's going to be Green moving through the middle, Hopper, Ward,
Kelly.
That grouping to be the difference. Now let's go on to the next game, Melbourne-Brisbane. And let's just stay on this screen for a second because we can.
I think so.
Two birds, one stone.
So the first thing that jumps out there is a little bit of a shift in recent weeks in Melbourne's strengths. So for the year as a whole, they've been a very good turnover side and a pretty decent clearance team. 2 goals a game better, 1 goal a game better. But that's spun around in the last month. They've become much more of a clearance winning team, which they weren't necessarily doing earlier in the year. 3 goals a game up on scoring from clearances is a big shift, and it was probably always coming with some of the personnel they have in there, but it did seem to be a while in the making when you consider the likes of Petrarca and Oliver in the middle there, and Gawn, obviously.
So when we talk about, there's a lot of talk amongst fans and commentators about plan A versus plan B, right? You've heard it, Sean. And it's like, what can they do? They need to go to a new plan B. But most teams don't have an articulated plan B. They'll do oppo analysis in the week beforehand, and they'll identify areas of strength and weakness for the opposition that they'll avoid. But in a game day situation, what you've committed to, it's really hard to communicate change to 23 people on the fly. You'll get a couple of discrete opportunities and you can change roles. but it's really hard to change entire strategies. I think for Melbourne, they've just had a bit more of a focus on their strength. And I guess teams can sort of half fox for the year and reveal their true strength in the last few weeks, especially if a team, they know they're heading towards finals. So let's
a good example of that. I think a good example of that came earlier in the year when Simon Goodwin told us personally in a press conference that they were really focusing on forward half turnover on ball retention and not conceding space so easily out of their own forward 50 after turnover. I think that was never their strength, and they were the worst team in the league at it last year, and they were very explicit they were focusing on it earlier in the year. And I guess drilling some of your weaknesses and new tools you want to develop is a perfectly valid thing to do across the first part of the year.
Yeah, look, and I'll quickly touch on this, but if we're talking about wings that need to be in the All-Australian team, that's a bit arbitrary because, most players don't line up.
Wings aren't real?
Well, they're not really. They start at the clearances and some of them play functionary, but often you'll get someone who's notionally a half forward, which is, that small to medium size forward or defender that will play that spacing wing, and sometimes I'll play the behind the stoppage wing. We've pointed this out in articles in the past, and if you are watching this, congratulations, you're one of three that have lasted this long. It rotates. It rotates even through the course of play. For most of play, wings don't really exist. They do, but they're important in the notion that
it's a situational concept. It's not a named role necessarily.
But nearly more important to the success of Melbourne and certainly the Dogs is the idea that small pressure forwards that create pressure on the exit kick out, and then the structure up of your wings, your halfback flanks, all those positions that, we historically know exist, but we know functionally probably don't, right? They structure up to create a wall to get that re-entry and that entry after that entry. That's why you'll see that the forward efficiency for some of these top teams aren't as good, but their inside 50 differential is much higher because what they're doing is they're getting a bunch of re-entries. And when we're talking about Melbourne here, their offensive score is below water. It's below league average, but their midfield score is a lot higher. The real balance of that is a bit different. When we're talking about pressure forwards for Melbourne, Neil Bullen is a top 3 in the league, I believe, for tackles inside 50. Kysaiah Pickett is dangerous every time he gets near the ball. And even their talls are quite good at chasing. Jackson's quite good at chasing. When Petrarca rests forward, he'll play as that third tall. Fritsch is not too bad at applying pressure. And that's how they get their points on the board.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways you see this is the offense score comes down if you rely on repeat entries and a lot of kicks to contest and that sort of thing. And
that's why we've got a lot of potent attacks in the league there that have slightly less than expected offensive scores because of the way that they attack.
Yeah, very much so. And then, of course, there's also how Ben Brown is fitting into that, which I think has taken a while to sort out.
Yeah, and
Melbourne's offense.
I don't think they had their intended setup to start the year, and I think they've adjusted on the run. So let's go back to that JT, that fourth tab there, JT Galliano. I'm almost certainly pronouncing it incorrectly. I apologise in advance.
You can see the Lions in a fair bit of form.
So there was a lot of thought when Danaher went down that they'd be done. But they've gone and Fuego. They've gone on fire.
Danaher's still there. Hipwood went down.
Oh, sorry, Hipwood.
Just so used to Danaher being the one.
Oh, no, it's like automatic. But I think there was a lot of thought that they would know what to do. But I guess what we've seen is Cameron has played some really good footy, and they're smaller forwards, and their supporting midfield has done fantastic. But no team has been better in either score differential from turnover or from clearances in the last month than the Lions. Is that enough to give them a hope? Is that enough to give them a hope of an upset 4v1?
I think they've stabilised enough. Like, we needed to see how they went with those losses and with the personnel they've got available now. But I guess one thing is Brisbane, it's not their first rodeo with only having one sort of key forward target, or, actually two, because Oscar McInerney. But, they did pretty well with just Hipwood last year. So all they've really needed to do is have Danaher do what Hipwood did last year. And everyone else there has been there. They know how to work around that setup. So I think that's probably not hurt them. And we know their other strengths, the way they get the ball out of the centre, the combination mid-forwards that they've got are also quite potent. So they have a lot of positional flexibility and role flexibility there. And it means they can keep up the intensity in the center while still having some of those guys further away able to, do their thing and stretch defenses.
Yeah, look, we wrote about it after.
Chance.
Oh, absolutely. It's on. We wrote about it last year with Neil and Lachie Neale winning the Brownlow again for the ABC. That he started out as a smaller forward target type for Fremantle, and a lot of his junior footy, because he was a bit smaller, they weren't sure if he could sort of change over to be that midfield guy. He certainly is, right? There's no doubt that he's one of the best midfielders in the game, but he still has that string to his bow. Zorko has that string. He started out playing mostly forward, now he's mostly midfield. Even Jared Lyons can kick goals and create.
McCluggage and McCarthy. There's a number of versatile pieces in that part of the ground for them.
So before we move on, let's go to one last thing of Melbourne versus Brisbane in that heat map.
They're actually pretty close. There we go.
So let's isolate the defense here.
Let's look at them in their rankings. There we go. So Melbourne best defense, Brisbane third.
But look at that. Melbourne, the distance from Melbourne to Brisbane is the same distance from Brisbane to Collingwood in ninth. So Melbourne's defence is their hallmark. May and Lever are both All-Australian. Salem, some question why he was even in the squad, but I reckon he might have been a bit hard done by there because he plays that critical quarterback-ish type role from defence and can rotate onto many targets. I suspect that this will be how Brisbane can find paths to goal, which we've just talked about, against this really, really hard to stop Melbourne defence is going to be the key to this one.
I agree. I think those group of people we were talking about should be able to think their way around the way May and Lev are set up and the way they cover each other and effectively cover so much space. That small group of, experienced mid-forward types should be pretty suited to routing around them and force Melbourne's smalls to do more.
If you have a look at this, it's the most potent attack in the league versus the most potent defence. For a week one final, that's what
you want to see.
That's exactly
and pretty evenly matched midfields.
Yeah, so it's going to be at the margins here. Again, 1v4 finals are never a fait accompli, but I think this year what we're seeing is probably the most even year in footy history. Certainly in my memory, certainly in our research.
At the top end of the finals.
Oh, absolutely. And let's go quickly on to the last game. And let's stay on
Melbourne, the Bulldogs and Essendon at their traditional home ground of Launceston.
Yeah, the traditional. Everyone's at their traditional home grounds this weekend, except for Port Adelaide, who have been shunted to the middle of Adelaide for some reason. They didn't get their game at Alberton. They should have. So let's have a look at the Dons. Now, you'll see that their attack. So can we go back to their attack there? We just saw that Brisbane's attack was the best in the league. No one would have predicted Essendon's attack as being the second best or equal second with Sydney. Sydney had Franklin come in. That's huge. That's, having the best player, best forward in the generation, adding him.
Australian Tom Papley.
Yeah, that's a good forward line, right? Last year it might not have been, but the difference of Franklin changes how you attack that.
How everything works. But
yeah,
Essendon have also been very efficient when they've gone forward.
Yeah, and you look at it and it's like, well, okay.
How are they doing it?
Stringer's had a good year, I guess, but it's all the little pieces.
Stewart.
Yeah. The sum of parts is more than the whole, I guess. It's less than the whole. The whole forward line and how they work. Peter Wright has fit in really well. Stringer. I know Anthony McDonald-Tipungwuti hasn't been playing in the last couple of weeks, but he was so important to them earlier this year. It's just worked for them up forward, and I think it's going to have to against the Dogs, because you'll have a look at there's one dark blue patch on this page. One super, super dark blue patch on this page.
And this has been the Bulldogs for years, even before they got Treloar in, although I can't remember if he's playing.
It's the super high defensive press that creates repeat entry after repeat entry. It's it really is. It means they get mismatched down back a hell of a lot, right? But they'll keep getting. It's all in recent weeks, it's all turnover. It's the midfield score. They'll just get an extra, that means they'll get 5 inside 50s for every 4 inside 50s in opposition, right? That's an extra, really, it's an extra chain of possession going forward for every opposition one. And that's just really hard to stop.
Yeah.
There's weaknesses, though, there, isn't there, Sean?
Particularly lately. Without buying too much into the Western Bulldogs are doomed narrative, I mean, we'll leave that to their own supporter base. That clearance differential has just swung on them in the last month. The Bulldogs have a really good midfield when they're all up and running. They, even with Beveridge doing whatever the hell he wants with the ruck, their midfielders have been able to run with it and dominate out of the stoppage, get the ball moving, and then use that high press to retain territory.
We actually talked to Luke Beveridge earlier this year, and we were pointed in the right direction by Adrian Polandrakius on Twitter and a few other great resting players on Twitter, that their midfield grouping is tighter than any others when it comes to centre bounce.
There's literally 4 or 5 of them.
They had that schedule interrupted about halfway through the year with their series of injuries, Dunkley, Treloar and Co, right? And they haven't quite found that balance again yet. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that when they're coming into sometimes the best team won't win the flag. The best team during the year will flame out before they get to the finals due to injuries or form. It happens, or they get worked out. I suspect that the Dogs have been worked out a bit. But that being said, you can't deny the talent they've got in that midfield group. And when they've got it together, Martin's been a huge out. So a lot of that clearance differential is because Martin doesn't win a lot of hit-outs, but he loses them to the right spots, and he loses them to somewhat predictable spots, especially for his midfielders to pounce on. Sometimes it's easier to prepare when you know you're going to lose the clearance, and the ruckman can kind of guide it to the right sort of direction rather than losing a hit-out sort of advantage.
And
sorry for the monologue.
Essendon are as good as anyone, sort of in terms of their potential to take that clearance stuff away from them as well. Some of their top midfielders are some of the best going right now.
Parrish has had a ridiculous year, and that's absolutely right. So where do you reckon this one's going to be decided, Sean?
I think it's going to come down to how much of their former strength the Bulldogs can get back. We know what Essendon are going to bring. They're a pretty high-risk, high-pace, reboundy sort of team. They've done quite well on turnover recently, but over the course of the year, they've copped it as much the other way. I think
it's really risky ball.
I think Essendon will bring what they bring. The Bulldogs' best would be good enough, but very serious questions about what the Bulldogs are actually able to produce right now. And
the other thing about the Dogs, and this is what happened, the Dons were able to do them. The Dogs zone up better than anyone. They will forward press, or however you want to call it, even if it's a man situation. It's playing off your man to a nice space to deny easy kicks. In the off-season, the Dogs didn't focus on how to exploit that in an attacking way. They worked out how to defend that with the stand rule. And they did better than anyone in the league in the first 11 weeks. And I suspect that everyone else in the league has taken a leaf from that book. And certainly the Dons shredded that, absolutely shredded them when they played last.
Yeah.
So
Sydney did it to them as well with a similar sort of game.
Yeah, and let's have a look at the Sydney Swans article and the points conceded one just super quickly.
Yeah.
That's the chart that we want. So you have a look at they've been really good at not conceding
from turnovers.
And when you look at Essendon, they've conceded nearly 10 points a game. So across the course of the year.
But that differential in both cases has shifted in the last month, according to
JT Galliano.
Yes.
Can we quickly look at the centre clearances just for a second, just before we finish here? Because I know we've been going well over time here. They concede a relatively low amount, about the same. So I think it's going to be about how many times Essendon can move the ball quickly and isolate the relatively poor tall defensive stocks of the Bulldogs. And find, say, Wright kicking another 48 goals in a game.
Yeah. We know the Bulldogs have had issues one-on-one as well, because they've been built to avoid leaving their defenders isolated.
So normally
when they actually do get isolated, they they tend to lose a lot of those contests.
We wrote about it earlier this year, and I keep saying we wrote about it. We recommend our articles for the ABC mostly because we wrote them. But you had a great chart there, Sean, that they had the worst contested one-on-one loss rate of any team. And that's just, they faced the least. That was the thing. They were able to avoid them. But I think that's changed a bit. I think teams are working out how to get them more.
How to get those contests.
Yeah. I think we're almost done here. Thanks for joining us. I reckon the 4 people who have listened in, I said 3 before, someone joined in halfway. We'll see where this goes. This was just an experiment because HPN, it's been going since 2014, I think, but we haven't done anything for a couple of weeks, months, years. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop us a line, hurlingpeoplenow@gmail.com or via Twitter, HPN Footy, I think is our Twitter handle, or either at R1 or at Capital City Cody's me, I think. I don't know. But thanks
yes, it is.
That's it. And thanks for listening. You got any closing remarks, Sean?
Oh, I don't think so. I hope the Swans win this week. I hope
the
Demons win this week.
Like, as a neutral, as a avowed football journalist and neutral, I hope that everyone has a good time. I hope footy is the true winner here. And that's the contested one-on-one rate. And yeah, the Dogs were certainly up there, but they were able to deny it early. That's great searching in the background, Sean. And if we have a look at this is actually really good at isolating all the teams here that we've talked about today. The Dons are very good at winning contested one-on-ones, and without Aaron Bruce, it's going to be very hard for them to pierce that. That's a really good chart.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we'll have to update it at some point.
Always happy for suggestions and comments. Get in touch with us. Otherwise, this has been The Breakdown. My name has been Cody Atkinson. That's been Mr. Ken Behrens himself, Sean Lawson. Join you next time.
Bye.